Hi, I'm Lisa Mills. I'm from Carleton University, the School of Public Policy and Administration. And along with Alex Mallet, I've been working on a project comparing mining in Australia, Canada, and Brazil. And I'm very happy to be at this conference. Thank you very much to the organisers. I really appreciate your efforts in putting the program together. So, I'm currently working on a paper about recent reforms to mining regulation in Queensland and Western Australia, and British Columbia in Canada. And in these three states and province, in the case of British Columbia, changes to legislation to compel mining corporations to at least partly rehabilitate land from which they've extracted minerals has been passed in the last few years. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on the state of Queensland. My argument will be that the reform of legislation with regard to the rehabilitation of mining sites has been put on the policy agenda as a result of environmental disasters in the case of Queensland and British Columbia. To some extent, that's also true in Western Australia, but the financial crisis and its impact on mining companies was actually the motivating factor in Western Australia. A change of government in the case of Queensland and British Columbia was also an important factor. In the case of Queensland, concern especially about the state's financial liabilities led to a reform of the financial assurance system, replacing the existing system with a two-tiered regime segmented according to the company's risk category. The mine rehabilitation requirements were also reformed, in which progressive rehabilitation over time is mandated by the legislation, and a plan that sets out the guidelines for the rehabilitation milestones to be achieved over the duration of the life of the mine. While both environmental groups and industry were generally happy with and supportive of the reforms in Queensland, industry was concerned about the retrospectivity of the legislation and lobbied to ensure that those who were mining before the new regime came into place on November the 1st, 2019, would not be subject to all of its strictures. And some of those who applied for environmental license before November the 1st, 2019, and in some cases even up to 2021 would not be subject to all of the requirements of the new legislation. So as a result of mining industry lobbying, the exemptions and the duration of time for which the exemptions extended actually continued up to 2021 in some circumstances. So it was a somewhat weaker piece of environmental legislation than envisaged at the beginning of the reform. So the structure of the presentation is as follows. I will be talking initially about why mine closure and rehabilitation is a problem. Then I'll have a brief discussion of the literature that's guiding my research. I will talk about what was involved in the reforms and the weaknesses of the reforms. So, what's the problem with mining rehabilitation or lack thereof? In Australia, it's estimated that 75% of mines are closed prematurely, or their closure is unplanned, meaning that the mine isn't closed down properly, it isn't necessarily backfilled to fill in the void that's been left after mining, and it's certainly not restored to restore the state of the previous ecosystem that existed, and often there are environmental problems arising from this lack of proper and planned closure. There's an estimated 50,000 abandoned mines in Australia. And some of the environmental problems that arise from this, one is acid mine drainage. This is when sulfidic rock and soil materials oxidize with moisture and bacteria to generate sulfidic acid solutions. And which then dissolve and may transport heavy metals, so there can be groundwater contamination along with earth contamination as a result of this. There can be non-acid metal leaching, heavy metal leaching as well, which can also cause earth and water contamination. Metal tailings. In the case of one mine, metal tailings actually caught on fire, contaminating not just earth and land, but also the air. There can be collapse or erosion of metal tailings. We've seen the consequences of that in Brazil, which my colleague Alex Mallet will be discussing. And in some cases, these contamination problems might be permanent. It may be that there has to be permanent care and treatment of the contaminated land or water. So companies may not close and rehabilitate the mine because they choose to put the mine in permanent care and maintenance. If a mining company states or has some kind of plan to reopen the mine in the future, they put the mine into care and maintenance. The problem in the event that they think, say, resource commodity prices are going to go up in future and they'll reopen the mine, start extracting resources again, they put the mine into care and maintenance. However, it's possible that it goes into care and maintenance for an extended period of time. It may never be reopened, in which case the environmental risks continue. There may also be a problem if the mine goes into liquidation, if the mining company goes bankrupt or the mine itself is no longer financially sustainable, so the company doesn't rehabilitate. Or another practice is that they sell the mine to a smaller and financially weaker firm that doesn't have the resources to rehabilitate the mine if they go into liquidation or if they decide to abandon mining without rehabilitating. So in Queensland, there's a number of examples of this. An historical example is Mount Morgan, in which copper, gold and silver was extracted from 1882 to 1990. The state government took over management of the mine in 1993, and it will possibly be treating acidic mine pit water in perpetuity. The Collingwood tin mine went into care and maintenance in 2008 and into liquidation in 2015. The mining licenses were disclaimed in bankruptcy proceedings for that mine. The Yabaloo nickel refinery, this was a mineral refinery rather than a mine, but it went into voluntary administration in 2016, and it had a large tailings dam that could present a huge environmental problem. Link Energy was probably the worst example of an environmentally irresponsible decision to allow this mine to go ahead. It was an underground coal gasification plant, the only other location in the world where underground coal gasification is permitted is Uzbekistan. The Link Energy set fire to an underground coal seam, captured and liquefied the gas. That was the idea of the mine. But in the process of inflaming the coal underneath the ground, the rock beneath the coal seam and the earth, which was actually being used for agricultural purposes, contaminated. So the rock cracked. The contaminants, including heavy metals and benzene and all sorts of other toxic contaminants, seeped through the crack in the rock and contaminated the agricultural land. That company went into voluntary administration in 2016. Okay, and so the financial assurance, such as it was for these companies and mines, was not sufficient to cover the cost of um, rehabilitating the mines. So the literature that I'm working with, my framework is relying a great deal on a book by Tracy Lynn Field, released in 2019, called State Governance, Mining Development and Sustainability. And Tracy Lynn Field talks about governance in two terms. In regard to rehabilitation, she talks about the need for the integration of mine closure. There can be operational integration when mine closure is integrated into systems of decision-making processes relating to the operation of the mine. So the whole operation, the planning for rehabilitation occurs throughout the mining operation. Temporal integration means that planning for rehabilitating and closing the mine occurs at the beginning of the mining process and throughout the mining process, not just at the end. And stakeholder integration occurs when the expectations of stakeholders and communities is incorporated into the planning process. This partial integration of these three kinds occurred in the Queensland case. However, Field is also concerned with the broader context in which mining occurs. She notes that mining regulation is an example of Polanyi's double movement. Polanyi talked about the way in which, when we have laissez-faire market practice is introduced, that there tends to be a movement towards freeing the market. There's a reaction on the behalf of the communities against that freeing of the market, and then the state steps in to re-regulate. But she says that that double movement actually acts to perpetuate the idea that sustainable development mining industry is possible, and it doesn't result in extractivism not being challenged. So to speak about the Queensland case, Queensland has 1/8 of the world's metallurgical coal for steel production. It's Australia's top producer of silver, lead, zinc and copper. The mineral industry represents 59% of the state's exports and 6.4% of the state's domestic product. If a company wishes to mine, it obtains a mining authority in the form of a mining lease from the Department of Natural Resources and Mines, and also an environmental authority from the Department of Environment and Science. So the reform was motivated by the mining company failures that I've already spoken about. It was preceded by an Auditor General's report in 2014, and as a result of the coincidence of the Auditor General's analysis and these massive environmental problems arising from mining company failure, there was an interdepartmental committee established which included the Office of the Premier and Cabinet. That interdepartmental committee commissioned a report by the Queensland Treasury Corporation, which is a financial management and a financial advising body within the Queensland government, and this led to reform legislation, the Mineral and Energy Resources Financial Provisioning Bill 2018. There were two areas of reform. One was reform of the financial assurance system. The other was reform of mine closure and rehabilitation guidelines. So the reform of the financial assurance system, before the reform, mining companies had to provide bank guarantees to cover the estimated rehabilitation cost in the event that a mining company went into liquidation and didn't or couldn't rehabilitate. The amount of assurance provided in the form of bank guarantees, however, did not cover the estimated rehabilitation costs, or at least not fully cover them, because there were discounts offered There was an inconsistent use of the calculator for calculating costs, so mining companies could choose whether to use their own calculator for calculating the costs of rehabilitation or the Department of Environment's calculator. There was variations in the calculator, and there were also often outdated cost estimates used in the calculations. So the legislation replaced this surety system of bank guarantees with a segmented system. In one system, companies continue to pay a surety, which could be a bank guarantee or another form, such as an insurance bond. This scheme applies to companies with less than $100,000 estimated rehabilitation cost, and it also applies to companies with less than a BBB- credit rating. In the second scheme, which applies to companies with credit ratings in the A or B range, companies pay a percentage of their estimated rehabilitation cost to the Queensland Treasury each year. And so it works like an insurance premium. The percentage that they pay varies between 0.5% and 2.75% of their estimated rehabilitation cost, depending on their credit rating. So if it's the credit ratings towards in the A or the A- range, they would pay 0.5%. If their credit rating is lower, they would pay a percentage up to 2.75% of their ERC. So the goals of the scheme were delivering a high level of environmental performance. However, the Queensland Treasury Corporation stated that a financial assurance system, financial provisioning system could not achieve this goal that needed to be achieved by other means. So very little weight was actually put on that. The other goals of the scheme were protecting the state's financial interest, not being a disincentive to industry, and satisfying community expectations. The system will be managed by a scheme manager in the Queensland Treasury, and it involved the recommendation that came from the Queensland Treasury Corporation of this two-tiered scheme. That the Queensland Treasury Corporation consulted extensively, and both the industry and environmental groups are largely happy with the scheme that they've come up with. The amendments to the Environmental Protection Act, however, have been more controversial. Neither the industry nor the environmental movement is entirely happy with what's happened here. So these amendments to the Environmental Protection Act are about ensuring that mine closure occurs because progressive rehabilitation, that is, rehabilitation of the mine that occurs over time during the life of the mine rather than the end, has been mandated in the legislation. So to ensure this, mining companies have to provide life of mine plans. When they apply for an environmental authority, they have to also provide a life of mine plan. They have to specify what the post-mining use of the land will be, or if they're proposing that the land not be rehabilitated, they have to provide a non-use mining area. They have to justify why they are planning for a particular kind of mining use, or that land would not be used after mining. So it has to be justified, and they have to consult with the community and relevant government bodies on this. They have to specify milestones in progressive rehabilitation, and they have to specify according to what timetable they will be meeting the milestones. However, there are weaknesses with this. These are that there will be no requirement to fill in voids left by mining. The word voids only appears twice in the legislation. They state that non-use mining area, that is land that would not be rehabilitated after mining, should be managed to a best practice standard, but what a best practice standard is not actually defined in the guidance documents. And the traditional or the the transitional provisions for companies who already have an environmental authority or were applying for an environmental authority at the time of reform. The mining companies do have to transition to the new regime by providing a life of mine plan if they are already operating a mine or in the process of applying for environmental authority. However, those who are mining or who have applied to mine before the new provisions came into place on November 1st, 2019, will be exempt from the justification and consultation requirements. So they don't have to justify their planned end of mine use or lack of use. And they don't have to consult with communities about it if they applied before then. If they have actually specified that it's going to be a NUMA, N-U-M-A, non-use management area, that is not be rehabilitated, and they have not just an environmental authority approving this, but several other kinds of documents stating that this would be okay, they actually have, if that document was provided by, in some cases, by 2021, they will not have to comply with all of these requirements. So these came about because the mining industry lobbied heavily against those that have applied having to, or those who have existing mines having to comply with the new reform regime. The other weakness of the reform is that projects which are of economic, social or environmental significance in Queensland are assessed by another body, the Coordinator General of Queensland, and they may be exempt from the reform requirements as well, and it's not yet clear under what circumstances a mine being assessed by the Coordinator General would be exempt from these requirements. So there is some improvement under this new reform regime, particularly the financial assurance, financial provisioning scheme is an improvement on what was there before. The effort to mandate progressivity is an improvement, but the many exemptions to this that were heavily lobbied for by industry are actually somewhat problematic. And definitely fit with Tracy Lynn Field's concerns about the double movement actually resulting in the ongoing perpetuation of practices in the industry that may not be environmentally sustainable. So I will leave it there, and I look forward to thoughts and comments from people who have viewed this video. Thank you very much for watching.